Once again, thanks for the opportunity to share with you all tonight. Lee gave you a little bit of an intro on the subject. It is Lieutenant Colonel William Darke. That was his rank in 1791 when he played his most important role in the history of Ohio. He, however, started out as probably as a private and ended his career as a general, which is not something that most soldiers can say. A little bit about what I do. I already mentioned that my research is focused on the 8th Virginia Regiment. I have a website. That's the address there. You might want to visit it sometime, take a look, poke around. There's a picture of Gordon on it, which might incentivize you to visit. I have a Facebook community. I post to that just about every day. I also have an Instagram account, and I've recently created a YouTube channel. There's only one video on there now, but you might enjoy seeing that. So hope you'll come and see me online sometimes. Here is our subject for today. This is William Darke. He is not well known anymore, but he played an important role in the history of Ohio. He was a cousin of Benjamin Rush, not that prominent himself, but he was born in southeastern Pennsylvania. His parents moved to the northern or lower Shenandoah Valley of Virginia when he was 5. At the time, it was the frontier. So he was not born, but definitely raised on the frontier. And let's just say he was described from time to time as having frontier manners, right? He was not, he didn't go to finishing school. He was a rough guy. This portrait was painted about 1800 by a local artist named Frederick Kemmelmeyer. I will show you one other painting by him before we're done tonight. It's kind of a rare treat to get a portrait of a soldier who was not a general. But this is him. If it's not from life, it was very shortly after he died. So there's little doubt that that's an actual image of what he looked like. Here is our setting. This is a pre-1753 map, a map for traders, Indian traders of the Ohio River Valley. It doesn't look like much, and that's the point. It was just the wilderness at the time. Here is a later map of roughly the same territory. The shaded area to the right is Virginia, what was then the settled parts of Virginia. This is the Blue Ridge right here, if you can see where my cursor's moving. So between that and the Alleghenies here, this is the Shenandoah Valley right here. What we in Virginia refer to as the tidewater, that's below the fall line, so down here around Williamsburg, and the Piedmont areas, that was the settled, civilized part of Virginia in the 1750s, 60s, and later. It was very ethnically uniform. It was very English. The Church of England was the official state church, and you were not allowed to have any other kinds of churches. It was a very different place from, say, Pennsylvania, where William Penn had granted religious freedom and people came from all over the place. On the far side of the Blue Ridge here, the elites down here in Williamsburg decided, well, you know what, we need to settle this area to create a buffer between us and the Indians and between us and the French. So they invited people to come from Pennsylvania. So it doesn't really show here, but there was a road that was referred to as the Great Philadelphia Wagon Road that came all the way from Philadelphia if you know the geography, west through Downingtown and Lancaster and York, Pennsylvania, out to Carlisle, and then cut south and led all the way through the Shenandoah Valley. This is the road right here in the Shenandoah Valley, and it continued south all the way to about Augusta, Georgia. This was what I referred to as the Oregon Trail of colonial America. All of inland, especially sort of southern America, was settled that way. And of course, they were not like the rest of Virginia. These were Germans and Scotch-Irish people who got off their boats in Philadelphia. The Lutheran Church or the Presbyterian Church or other communities would assist them, help them get equipped, and then they would head west, and many of them settled here. So the Shenandoah Valley at the time of the Revolution was a very distinct community in Virginia. It was very German and Scotch-Irish, unlike the rest of Virginia. Now, Darke was one of the earlier ones to come, or his parents were. He lived here in the north end of the Shenandoah Valley, or it's the lower valley because the river flows north. So that is now Jefferson County, West Virginia. Just a little bit south in the valley is the city of Winchester in Frederick County. I will tell you a little bit about Fort Loudon, which was in Winchester. So and then a little bit more about the geography. Down here you can see Williamsburg. The Alleghenies were pretty much impassable. You could not get over them on a horse. The only way to get across them to the Ohio country or to Kentucky was to go all the way up to Pittsburgh or Fort Pitt and float down the river. Or once they discovered it, you could go south and then cut through the Cumberland Gap. If you wanted to go by horse, those were the only ways you could go. So you know the story of the French and Indian War, I'm sure. The French claimed the territory that we think of as Ohio. They started to butt heads after the Shenandoah Valley and the areas beyond it started to get settled. And that led to the French and Indian War. The first major conflict of that, of course, was Braddock's expedition against Fort Duquesne. That set out from, really from Alexandria, which is over here, but they had to cut a road from Fort Cumberland here through the forest, through the wilderness to get there. And you know how that ended. They were ambushed, surrounded by Indians and some French. The soldiers panicked, they huddled together and suffered massive casualties. I'm not telling you yet about what happens over here in the Battle of Wabash, but I will tell you that it looked very similar to Braddock's defeat. And that will be sort of the climax of my presentation tonight. So moving on, here's an image of Braddock's defeat. This is when George Washington started to become kind of a hero, right? So when the British Redcoats panicked and huddled together and made easy targets for the Indians, Washington, who was commanding experienced Virginia frontiersmen, they conducted themselves much better. And Washington himself acquitted himself quite well and came out of it a hero. Traditionally, in the early biographies, people believe that our subject for tonight, William Darke, was there. He was 19 years old at the time. If he was there, as a soldier, he certainly would have been a private. If he was there, he might also have been like Daniel Morgan. He might have been a wagon driver. We just don't know for sure. Some historians have doubted that he was there at all, but Darke himself did say in a letter to George Washington many years later, something to the effect that, as you know, I have served my country, in war in some capacity since 1755. So he was doing something at the time of Braddock's defeat. After Braddock's defeat, I'll use clean language. All heck broke loose in Western Virginia and along the frontier. settlers started to move back east to keep their families safe. That was a problem for Virginia. Washington was in charge of the Virginia Regiment. There was only one regiment. And this is Fort Loudon, which was built at Winchester. And this was Washington's base of operations for most of the French and Indian War. And out of this fort, there was a unit known as Rutherford's Rangers. We know for a fact that Darke was a member of Rutherford's Rangers. They would patrol the wilderness to see what the Indians were up to and ring the alarm if there was an attack coming. He acquitted himself well. Rutherford complimented him, and we know that he had the rank of corporal at that time. So he was in the French and Indian War. He was active in some capacity in 1755. He was a corporal in Robert Rutherford's Rangers for a couple of years. That is Captain Rutherford there. He was later a member of Congress. After the war, he married a widow. Her first husband was literally caught napping under an elm tree and was scalped and killed by Indians. Darke raised one child from her first marriage. He had 4 children of his own, and they adopted another orphan who later played a very important role in Ohio history. Thomas Worthington is the person I'm talking about. He was one of Ohio's first 2 U.S. senators and later a governor of Ohio. He was raised by William Darke. So then the Revolutionary War starts. Obviously we're skipping some time here. And he was commissioned by the Berkeley County Committee as a captain in the 8th Virginia Regiment. So the picture you see to the right there is Colonel and later General Peter Muellenberg. He's famous as the Fighting Parson. He was a minister, practicing minister when he got his commission and never returned to the pulpit. The story is that he gave a sermon from Ecclesiastes, which you may know ends with there was a time for peace and a time for war. And he shouted, "It's time for war." And that was the end of his farewell sermon. That's Peter Muellenberg's signature there. The lieutenant colonel was Abraham Bowman, and the major was Peter Helfenstein. All 3 of them are Germans. The regiment was intended to be a quote-unquote German regiment. Remember what I told you about the ethnic makeup of the Shenandoah Valley. They may have intended it to be German. It didn't turn out to be completely German. There are a couple of different explanations for that. My favorite one is I think that the political leadership in Williamsburg wanted to recruit in the Shenandoah Valley, but they wanted to make darn sure that Germans were running it, not the Scotch-Irish. Scotch-Irish were not regarded as tame at the time. They were regarded as kind of wild. I think they wanted orderly German. The stereotypes were pretty much the same back then. So he was in the 8th Virginia. Their first duty was to go down towards Norfolk, Virginia, to stop Tories from trying to supply the governor, the royal governor, who had fled to a boat and had sort of a military fleet in the Hampton Roads. The governor had also offered freedom to slaves who fled their plantations and joined his army. He formed what he called his Ethiopian Regiment of African-American soldiers. So the 8th Virginia tried to, their jobs were to suppress Tories and stop slaves from joining Lord Dunmore's army. Then this guy showed up in town. He's not too handsome. This is, even though it's a cartoon, it's regarded as the best image of him. This is Major General Charles Lee. No relation to Robert E. Lee or Light Horse Harry Lee. He was exposed, I think in 1858 as a traitor. He's not my favorite guy, and he was not the favorite guy of the 8th Virginia either. But he was the 2nd ranking officer in the Continental Army after only George Washington. He was an experienced British professional soldier. So he was put in charge of the Southern Department, so that's Virginia and all of the colonies to the south. He showed up in, I think, April of '76. organized the army. They learned at about that time that British generals Clinton and Cornwallis were headed south with an army on transports, and he looked around Williamsburg and said, "Okay, who are the most equipped, best armed soldiers that we have?" It was the 8th Virginia, and he said, "Okay, you guys were headed south." So they went south with Charles Lee. They were at the they were at the Battle of Sullivan's Island, sometimes better known as the Battle of Fort Moultrie. They were not in the fort. They were either in Charleston preparing for an attack on the city itself, or some of them were on the north end of Sullivan's Island, blocking an amphibious assault from led by Cornwallis. And then just about everybody got malaria, and I mean bad. Darke's company was almost completely wiped out. And when I say wiped out, I mean dead. These soldiers were from inland Virginia, from the Shenandoah Valley, from the hills of what's now West Virginia. They had no developed resistance to malaria whatsoever. If you grew up in Charleston, you had a developed resistance. These soldiers had none, and they got very, very sick, and a large number of them died. Because of that, Darke was himself almost certainly very sick, and he was left behind in Charleston when Charles Lee proceeded to go further south. They were going to attack the new British colony of East Florida. They were going to sack St. Augustine. But only the healthy guys went. Major Helfenstein, whose signature you just saw, he was very sick and he went home. He resigned and went home, where he died. Darke should have been promoted to replace him, but because he was left behind in Charleston, sick himself, maybe not expected to survive, he was passed over for promotion. Major Campbell from Shenandoah County was made major instead. Then Darke survived, obviously, and then he was inoculated for smallpox, which was no fun. He was at the Battle of Short Hills in New Jersey. He was detached to Maxwell's light infantry, probably fought under Maxwell at both Couch's Bridge in Delaware and the Battle of Brandywine. And then he finally got his promotion. He contested it. Major Campbell was transferred to a different unit, and Darke got promoted to major just in time for the Battle of Germantown, where he was captured. He was a prisoner of war for 3 years. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel while a prisoner, and eventually exchanged for Governor Henry Hamilton, who was sometimes known as the hair buyer general. He allegedly paid Indians for American scalps, and he was captured by George Rogers Clark in 78, I think. So Darke was exchanged just in time to lead soldiers at the victory of Yorktown. So very long and very distinguished service in the Revolutionary War. His service in the war and in the French and Indian War, and his residence in Virginia connected him with George Washington repeatedly. They had a professional or military connection for 4 decades, at least. They were both at Fort Loudon in Winchester during the French and Indian War, if they weren't both at Braddock's defeat. They were both in the Revolutionary War and interacted with each other. After the war, one of George Washington's pet projects was the Potomac Canal, which I could go on at some length about, but that's not our topic for tonight. The Potomac Canal was going to parallel the Potomac River and extend further northwest to connect with the Ohio River for commercial purposes. and also political purposes. And Darke worked with Washington for at least a decade on that project. Darke, and this being your Constitution Day event, I will highlight this. Darke, of course, was not at the Constitutional Convention. George Washington was. But after the Constitution was drafted in Philadelphia, the states then each had to ratify it. And Virginia, like other states, had a ratification convention. Virginia's was particularly important because Virginia was a very large and important state. It was also very deeply divided. You probably know that there were so-called Federalists and Anti-Federalists at the time. The Anti-Federalists included notable people like Patrick Henry, George Mason, and a number of others. And it only passed, the ratification only passed by, I think, 9 votes. Darke was a delegate to that convention. And he did vote to ratify the Constitution. So that's a pretty big deal. He also was active in trying to pick a site unsuccessfully for the District of Columbia. The first Congress, after Washington became president, and the first Congress was sworn in, enacted legislation citing the District of Columbia along the Potomac River. But they didn't say precisely where. It had to be somewhere between a particular creek and Georgetown. Darke was part of a crew of guys that tried to convince Washington, whose choice it was, to site it at Sharpsburg, Maryland, which was directly across the Potomac River from Shepherdstown, which is the town Darke was from. It was considered, obviously not selected. The Georgetown site was selected, but that's kind of fun and interesting. So then, again, with this theme of Darke being connected with Washington, they were obviously connected on the Sinclair expedition, which I'm going to spend most of the rest of my time talking about, into Ohio. He also was selected by Washington to help suppress the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. He served directly under Daniel Morgan in that. And then when Washington retired as president, Darke, I think, drafted and on behalf of all of the citizens of what was then Berkeley County, sent a resolution to Washington congratulating him on his retirement. And Washington responded to that. So these are just the known interactions between Darke and Washington. Here is a sword that was a gift from William Darke to George Washington. I don't think we know when he gave it to Washington, but it is known that Washington wore it when he was inaugurated in New York City the first time he took the oath of office as president. Pretty neat thing. The sword is now in the collection of the museum at Morristown National Historic Park. Okay, here we are back to our map. So after the revolution is over, the victory meant for people in Western Virginia, Western Pennsylvania, that they now finally had the opportunity to move west, which had been the goal for most of them all along. When we learn about the revolution in grade school, we hear a lot about tea and taxes and the Stamp Act and this sort of thing. For people in Western Virginia, what they really wanted was the opportunity to go west and settle new land so that they could be property owners too. But the Proclamation Line, which was a line down the ridge of the Alleghenies, put there in statute in 1763, had basically made it illegal for anybody to settle west of the Alleghenies. The king had decided it was just too expensive to fight Indians. So now that America was independent, people had the opportunity to go west. So this is the Northwest Territory. It is Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, parts of Minnesota. All of this was, according to its charter, part of Virginia. Some of that claim was contested. You'll see that shaded area in Northwest Ohio that was claimed by Connecticut in its charter. That's why that area is known as the Western Reserve. It was the Connecticut Reserve. So this is where people wanted to go. This is where people wanted to go, cut down trees and build farms and live. As you might imagine, Indians didn't like that idea too much, particularly the Shawnee. People had been trying to fight Indians, suppress Indians, and settle this area for quite some time already. Many of the Indians up there had been allies of the British during the Revolution. So there were repeated expeditions into this territory over decades, and virtually all of them had failed. So now, I'll just run through some of them here. So I start with Braddock. He didn't technically try to go into Ohio, but it was in the same region, and we all know how that went. Andrew Lewis in 1774 during Lord Dunmore's War. You might not know what that is. That was the last major Indian war before the Revolution. He actually succeeded at the Battle of Point Pleasant in a major battle. Didn't take any permanent territory from the Indians, but it was a battle against the Indians that was successful, and a very big one. Edward Hand in 1778 attempted an expedition into the Ohio country. It did not go well. Lachlan McIntosh initiated an expedition into the Ohio country. His goal was to take Fort Detroit from the British. Did not go well. George Rogers Clark, who did have successes on the frontier, he wanted to take Fort Detroit, failed. Daniel Broadhead, who took over from Lachlan McIntosh as the commandant at Fort Pitt, he wanted to go into the Ohio country and was unable. William Crawford in 1782, he led an expedition. I think it's referred to as the Sandusky expedition. He was captured by the Indians and brutally tortured and killed. Charles Scott led an expedition out of Kentucky in 1790, failed. And then Josiah Harmer led an expedition on behalf of the federal government in 1790, organized by President Washington to pacify the Indians in the Ohio country, and he failed as well. Which brings us to Arthur St. Clair and back to William Darke. So 1791, they're going to try again, this time with a bigger, better trained, better equipped army. So here's our map once again. So the plan is they are going to rendezvous up here at Fort Pitt and then float down the river all the way here to Fort Washington, which is now, as you most certainly know, Cincinnati. And then just like Braddock had tried to do however many years before, they were going to cut a path through the wilderness up here to where the key Indian settlements were. This time they weren't going to cut a road, just a trace. The difference is that a road can carry wagons. A trace is just good enough for pack horses. The army was composed of the 1st U.S. Regiment, which was the only professionally trained full-time regiment the federal government had at that time. The 2nd U.S. Regiment, I should correct myself, there were 2, but the 2nd Regiment was brand new. It had just been recruited, so these guys were not experienced. And then there were militia companies, and then U.S. levy regiments. There were two of them. Levies were federal troops that were recruited for short service, I think in this case for 6 months. So at the end of 6 months, they were done and they could go home. So that was the Army, and they rendezvoused up here at Fort Pitt and went down to Fort Washington. This is Fort Washington. This is kind of a special picture. It's a little bit eerie. It is Fort Washington after, I guess, a light snow. And I forget the artist's name, but it was sketched in 1791 at the start of the St. Clair expedition by a soldier who within a few weeks was dead. And it was discovered, I forget the story, but a decade or two ago, literally in a tin box in an antique store, along with some correspondence and other items. So that is what Fort Washington looked like at the time, and that is where they rendezvoused. Here is a old map of Ohio. The expedition went up these western counties up to here. And then zooming in just a little bit, you can see a little bit closer. And then I've got a little animated thing here. You can see here where it says Cincinnati and Fort Washington there. And then this is roughly the path they took. It's a little bit jerky because it takes a lot of memory. But that is the path that they went. There's a little spoiler there, St. Clair's defeat. When they, it took weeks to get up there, and they had all sorts of problems. They had supply problems. They had morale problems. The officers kept bickering. Darke with the 1st U.S. Levy Regiment and Lieutenant Colonel Gibson with the 2nd U.S. Levy Regiment had a big fight over who was going to get to be the 1st regiment and who was going to get to be the 2nd regiment based on seniority. They had desertion problems. They moved more slowly than anticipated, and it started to get cold, and then it froze. And of course, they had to run a supply line. I forget how many miles we're talking about, but it's a very long distance. They had to run a supply line all the way from Fort Washington up to where they were going. And if the pack horse train moved slowly, well, then people would just start being hungry, right? So this is the camp on the eastern branch of the Wabash on November 4th of 1791. And you can see how they're arrayed here. They are in a square. They have some artillery. These are cannons. I don't know how well you can see the picture here. Right here it says Butler. That is Brigadier General Richard Butler, who oversaw all of the levies. So Darke was directly beneath his command. Here's the 2nd U.S. Regiment. You will note that there is no 1st U.S. Regiment on this chart. That is because the 1st U.S. Regiment had been sent halfway back down the path they had cut after deserters. They had a large group of deserters decide, you know what, we've had it with this, we're out of here. And they snuck off in the middle of the night. And the best soldiers in the Army, the only experienced and professional unit, was sent back down the path to go get them. So they're gone, and in the morning, they are surrounded by Indians. And it is just like Braddock's defeat all over again. They're not ready, they're not prepared. General Sinclair is suffering from a terrible case of gout, so he's not even able to really stand up in command. They've got civilians with them, women who are cooks and such, and it just turns into just butchery. The Indians get to the cannons and take out the cannons before there's any sort of organized response. This is not a great image. It's pixelated, but it is the most accurate image I could find. For one thing, there's snow on the ground. And most of the Americans are already dead on the ground. I don't recall the precise numbers, but several hundred Americans died. And it is the highest casualty event for any American army until the Battle of Shiloh in the Civil War. The soldiers panicked. Darke describes this in a letter. He said they huddled together like a mob at a county fair. And this happened at Braddock's defeat too. Your instinct when there's danger is to huddle together. But that's the worst thing you can do, because then the Indians didn't even need to aim. They could just point and shoot at that mob of people. Darke acquitted himself quite well. He was able to identify soldiers who were not panicking and got them to help him organize an assault against the Indians. They chased them about 400 yards in one direction, but there was no backup, so they had to return. When it was clear that the battle was being lost, he organized a number of soldiers to conduct an organized push through the line in the direction of the road that they had cut so that they could escape. And they fled for their lives. Now, when I say they fled for their lives, I mean the survivors only. Hundreds of soldiers, all of the women were dead, were dying on the ground. Darke was wounded in the leg. His son, who he had selected to be a captain in his levy regiment, was shot in the head. He picked him up, put him on the horse, and rode off with him. They went about half the way back to Fort Washington, where they had built a small fort. They called it Fort Jefferson. It was really just a supply base. And that is where the escaped and wounded soldiers congregated. They had no supplies, no blankets, nothing. They'd left everything back at the battlefield. Darke then proceeds to spend days trying to help the wounded and dying soldiers, including his son. Arthur Sinclair was no particular help. He just headed back to Fort Washington. Major John Hamtramck, I think that's a Swiss name, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. He was in charge of that first U.S. regiment that had gone back after the deserting soldiers. He never backed anybody up. And when Darke asked him for help, he just joined Arthur Sinclair and went back to Fort Washington. So remember, Darke is wounded. He's on a horse. He rides, I think it's 31 miles back to Fort Jefferson from the battlefield, does his best to care for his son, and then he rides all the way down to Fort Washington to try to get supplies, to try to get help to go back. He goes back and forth, and he's just desperate, trying to keep his son alive, trying to help people, and he's not getting the help he wants. He then writes a report to George Washington, which is the first news that Washington gets of the defeat. This has been interpreted as a somewhat political document. Darke was very careful to make sure that he was the first one to tell the story to the president. He was very angry at his experience. His son is dying. It took his son weeks to die. He's grieving. I'm not going to read it because it's pretty long, but I would encourage you to look for it. He writes this just very detailed account of the battle to President Washington. Singles out certain soldiers as heroic and brave, singles out a couple of them as cowards, says that Sinclair was not much use, and he formally charges John Hamtramck with cowardice, and in fact organizes a court-martial at Fort Washington. Throughout all of this, remember, Darke is wounded. He says that his leg has swollen up to be as thick as the trunk of his body. his son dies. Darke eventually heads back home. Here is a contemporary image of the death of General Butler, the highest ranking death on the battlefield. This was a major event in American history at the time. It was a very political event. Here is an image from a narrative that Theodore Roosevelt wrote for, I think it was Harper's Monthly or Harper's Weekly in the 70 years later. The bodies were left frozen in the snow for months until somebody went out to get them. Here is a contemporary newspaper account. You'll notice at the top all the pictures of coffins. Each one has the name of a dead officer above it. The defeat of St. Clair at the Battle of Wabash was the subject of the very first congressional oversight investigation. Darke was a witness in a committee hearing, but it was the very first congressional oversight hearing into executive branch conduct. You'll see, and here is a story about it from the time of the Benghazi investigation. Even during President Trump's impeachment, it came up as a precedent. This is Michael McConnell, a former appellate judge, writing an essay saying that just because Trump didn't share certain documents, that's not an impeachable offense. In fact, George Washington did the same thing after St. Clair's defeat. So, very historic event in that regard too. So Darke returns home. His son is dead. When he gets home, he finds that one of his two other sons is mortally ill and that he dies too. His third son, by the way, died about 4 years later. So all of his sons died. But he is well regarded. Virginia regards him as kind of a hero. So they very promptly name a town after him, close to his home. It's still a place in West Virginia. It's now Jefferson County, West Virginia. The houses there date to the 1790s. This is a log house under aging clapboard siding. It never prospered to the extent that the houses had to get torn down so that bigger ones could be built. It is a historic preservation project in the waiting. A lot of the houses look a lot like this. And then, then a few years later, the Whiskey Rebellion happens. I think you probably know the story. The federal government needs revenue. Alexander Hamilton decides that they're going to put a tax on distilled spirits. Farmers in the West think it's discriminatory, and they are literally up in arms. Washington personally leads troops out towards Pittsburgh to suppress the rebellion. General Darke, he's now a general in the Virginia militia, serves under Major General, what's the matter with me? Daniel Morgan, in leading the Virginia troops and suppressing the Whiskey Rebellion. He acquits himself well there as well. So this is a painting by Frederick Kemmelmeyer, the same guy who did the portrait of Darke, of Washington reviewing the troops at Fort Cumberland, Maryland. Darke was there, and it was probably the last time that Darke and Washington saw each other. There's every reason to think that they would have interacted, particularly since Darke was a general at this time. This guy here, if I could zoom in on the picture, I'm pretty sure that's Daniel Morgan.
Yes.
It just looks like him.
It does.
I would like to think that this guy is William Darke, but I can't really claim to know that he is. This might be Light Horse Harry Lee. He was the governor of Virginia at the time, but he led the troops into this in suppressing the Whiskey Rebellion. Washington himself did not go all the way to Pittsburgh. He had to get back to Philadelphia to meet with Congress. So Darke was, I like to say that he started out as a private and made it to general. He served in 4 different armed conflicts: the French and Indian War, Revolutionary War, the Sinclair expedition, and the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion. That's quite a distinguished career. Here is his grave. That is a photo from 100 years ago. As happens, that tombstone is now in many pieces. This one was replaced it some years later with erroneous information on it. And these are recent plaques that were put at the grave site when the graveyard was rehabilitated not long ago. One of the counties that that the Sinclair expedition traveled through is now called Darke County. In fact, Fort Jefferson, where Darke so desperately tried to assist his mortally wounded son, was right here in Darke County, just south of Greenville. So it's fitting, appropriate, and sad that that particular county is named after Darke. You'll note that his name is misspelled here on this old map. Here's the Darke County seal, Darke County Courthouse. There is his signature. And that is my presentation.
Good.
Very good.
Very good.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed it.
I have a couple questions.
Yeah, fire away.
You mentioned that he was inoculated for smallpox. At the time he was down in the New Jersey area, was that part of General Washington's inoculation program?
Yes. Yeah. So the 8th Virginia hobbled back from the South in November, December of 1776. Many of them still sick with malaria. And then in the early spring, they rendezvoused outside of Philadelphia where they were inoculated. Once they had recovered from that, they then went to New Jersey to meet up with the Army.
My second question was, he was captured. Did he serve his imprisonment on prison ships in New York?
So it's not completely clear, and I would like to know more. The traditional story is that he was put on a prison ship in Philadelphia first. His wife supposedly dressed up like a man and went to meet him on the boat and brought him some supplies. And then he was brought up to New York. Enlisted guys were put on those ships. Officers were given better treatment. So he was on Long Island, probably at in what's now Brooklyn, Greater Brooklyn. New Utrecht, I think, was the town where most of the officers were kept. Officers were treated pretty well. They were given parole, which meant, as you probably know, that they could come do whatever they wanted as long as they stayed in town and didn't try to escape. They also had to fend for themselves, like financially. The British didn't give them any food. So he and some of the other officers ran out of resources and wrote a letter to Governor Thomas Jefferson asking for support. Virginia didn't have any money, so what they wanted to do was send them tobacco. Virginia had lots of tobacco. So Jefferson wrote a letter to George Washington saying, hey, we would like to ship up some tobacco for the use of the officers in Long Island. Do you think the British will allow that? And Washington said, no, they won't allow that, but send the tobacco, we'll sell it, and then give the proceeds to the soldiers. Darke later had to reimburse the governor of Virginia for that tobacco, and there's some documentation over that. So, what else can I tell you, gentlemen?
I have a question as to whether or not you know or have records of George Rogers Clark having an opportunity to share some of Darke's experiences, specifically in regards to to how to keep yourself from getting wiped out. Because when you read about George Rogers Clark, apparently he did have the habit of picking the brains of people who exhibited this kind of valor under stress.
Yeah.
Do you know that if that's for sure, or just conjecture on my part?
I have no reason to believe that Darke and Clark knew each other. With one caveat, and that is that George Rogers Clark's older brother, Jonathan Clark, was a captain in the 8th Virginia.
Ah.
So
okay.
They may have known each other, but they didn't. I've no knowledge that they ever served together. So.
Thank you. By the way, excellent. I appreciate your contribution to my mentality.
George Rogers Clark is a great figure, and a friend of mine, Eric Sterner, has just written a new book on George Rogers Clark. It's coming out in a couple of weeks, so you might want to.
I'll keep an eye out for it. He's one of my favorites. Him and Green were both just irreplaceable during that whole effort of the Revolutionary War. People just they came up with ideas that were just shattering. Yeah.
I need to correct myself. Eric is working on a book on George Rogers Clark. He has a book coming out on the Gnadenhutten Massacre, which is an Ohio event.
Yes.
That preceded a lot of other stuff. He's working on a book on Clark now. I misspoke. But he has a book coming out in a couple of weeks on the Gnadenhutten Massacre and the torture of William Crawford and all of that.
Yeah.
Who's that author?
Eric Sterner, Sterner. The book is called, I think it's called Anatomy of a Massacre.
Thank you.
I have a personal view that a lot of revolutionary history gets ignored. The story that we all hear starts in Boston, moves down to Philadelphia, and then we jump to Yorktown, right? There's a lot of history, like Southern history. Cowpens seems like it's finally getting attention, but Nathaniel Greene seems like he's finally getting attention, but a lot of Americans just don't know anything about those campaigns in the South. They don't know anything about the Battle of Sullivan's Island and Fort Moultrie, and the West also gets ignored. The soldiers I focus on, the 8th Virginia, most of them, the reason they wanted to fight was so they could go live where you guys live now.
Yeah.
Right? It's history that people just don't, just doesn't get recognized. And, George Rogers Clark, that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. So
Mr. Neville, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Along the same period of time, there was Lockery's massacre out of Lockery out of Westmoreland County in Pennsylvania. His massacre took place in southern Indiana, just a few miles from here. Do you know if they had any interaction with this expedition to Fort Clark?
I've heard of Lockery's massacre, but I don't recall exactly when it was. Do you know the exact date?
No, the year it was put together was 81, but the trek, the whole thing took several years.
Right. Yeah, I doubt that there's a close connection between the two.
Okay, I was just curious.
They're a decade apart, for one thing. What else can I tell you, gentlemen?
Well, thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. It was well received on this end, and maybe we could do this kind of thing again. It was very nice. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
How did we do on time, Lee?
Questions? Go ahead and speak now. Forever hold your peace.
Well, I'll give you the post log here, the epilogue. The Sinclair expedition ended in catastrophe, but it was that event that finally convinced Congress that they needed to have an actual, real, full-time, well-equipped army.
Right.
And that army was put under the command of Anthony Wayne. He took, I forget the timeline, but he took the better part of a year to get them properly trained. And that led to the Battle of Fallen Timbers in '94, which finally, after decades of trying, language they would have used, put down the Indian uprisings. And it was because those soldiers were off busy already doing that Washington had to federalize Virginia and Pennsylvania militia to put down the Whiskey Rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
Darke was not chosen to serve with Anthony Wayne, in part because he had been so nasty in criticizing his commanders during St. Clair's expedition. So he was a hothead. So,
Where would we be without hotheads?
indeed. Indeed.
Gabe, we thank you so much for being with us tonight. We really do. And I just want you to know that when you get the envelope that's got the little thumbstick on it with the recording, we'll also be sending you a little memento of your time with us tonight.
Oh, thank you.
We do appreciate the time that you spent with us and sharing your expertise in this particular area with all of us.
Thank you, Lee.
You can just never get enough history behind you.
No, and we need to hear it now more than ever.
We certainly do.
Yeah.
We certainly do. So, gentlemen, if you have no other questions for Gabe, I'm going to go ahead and pull an end to this and let Gabe go relax a little bit. And look forward to seeing you guys again real soon.